Marcus Webb had not let anyone touch his face in 6 years. Not since the blast outside Kandahar took his sight and left a jagged scar running from his left temple to the corner of his jaw, and he had built a life around that refusal the way other men build a life around a career or a family. He sat on the same bench in Fairview Park every afternoon at 4 o'clock. cane resting against his knee, listening to a city he could no longer see move around him. He was 38 years old. He had been a staff sergeant. He had been, before that, before any of it, a person who laughed easily. And the man on the bench now was someone he still hadn't fully introduced himself to. The scar was the least of what he'd lost that day. But it was the part strangers reacted to first. And Marcus had learned to read the silence that followed a stranger's glance. The way he'd once read terrain, the slight intake of breath, the too careful evenness of a voice, trying not to sound different. He had stopped expecting anything else from people. He came to the park because the sound of it, a specific mix of birds and traffic and children 200 feet away at the playground, was the closest thing he had left to a view. What he did not expect on a warm Tuesday in October was the sound of two small sets of footsteps stopping directly in front of his bench, followed by a silence that did not carry the careful evenness of adult discomfort. It carried something else. Curiosity, unguarded and total, the kind only children still had. A voice said, "Our dad has a scar just like that." Marcus turned his head toward the voice out of a reflex he'd never fully unlearned. He said, "Does he?" in the flat, closed tone he used for strangers. Expecting the moment to pass the way these moments always passed, a parent appearing, an apology, small feet retreating. But the second voice, identical to the first in a way that told him these were twins before anyone said so, added, "It goes from here to here, finger." He assumed was tracing a line in the air near her own temple. "Just like yours." Ren thought it was the same person. Marcus went very still. He said carefully, "What's your dad's name?" Before we continue, if you believe that kindness has no rank and grace wears no uniform, please like this video. Subscribe to Kindness Tales, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again today. The twins were 7 years old, named Ruby and Ren Cole. And they had grown up hearing exactly one story about their father's face that he'd been heard overseas before they were born. That the scar was from something brave, and that he did not like to talk about it. Which, as far as they understood, meant it was a subject for quiet voices and careful questions, not silence. Their father, Elias Cole, raised them alone in a 2-bedroom apartment 11 blocks from the park. Working as a maintenance supervisor at a mid-sized apartment complex, a job that paid enough to keep them fed and reliably home by 6, but not enough to leave much room for anything extra. Their mother had left when the girls were too unable in the end. To build a life around a man who had come back from deployment changed in ways she didn't have the patience or the tools to sit inside of. Elias had raised Ruby and Ren by himself since, carrying a wound that had never fully closed, not the scar itself, but the guilt underneath it, a specific, gnawing guilt he had never spoken aloud to another living person. Marcus did not know any of this yet. What he knew, sitting on a park bench with his cane gripped tighter than it needed to be, was that a woman's voice, the twins' aunt he would later learn, tasked with picking them up that afternoon, was now approaching, apologizing for her nieces bothering him, gently steering them away. Marcus, who had spent 6 years perfecting the art of letting moments like this pass without comment, found himself saying, instead, "Wait." The aunt paused. Marcus said, "I'm sorry. Can I ask where your brother-in-law served?" "I don't mean to overstep. It's just the scar they're describing is very specific." A practical woman named Denise, who had spent a fair amount of her life smoothing over the edges of her sister's absence for these girls, hesitated, then said, "Kandahar province. About 7 years ago," and he doesn't talk about the details. She paused. "Why?" Marcus felt something drop through the center of his chest. The particular vertigo of a memory surfacing whole and uninvited. He said, "I was there. Same province. Same year." His voice had gone quiet in a way it hadn't in a long time. "There was a man in my unit. Elias Cole. We called him Coley." He stopped. "He pulled me out of a vehicle that was on fire. I never got to thank him properly, because I was told afterward that he didn't make it, that he died getting the rest of us clear. Denise went very still. Ruby and Wren, sensing the shift in the adults around them without understanding it, had gone quiet too. Watching Dot, Denise said slowly, "Elias didn't die. He came home with a traumatic brain injury and a scar and about a year of hospital stays. We don't talk about much. He doesn't talk about the accident at all. Actually, he told us once that the last thing he clearly remembers from that day is pulling someone out of a burning vehicle and then nothing. For almost 8 months, just fragments. He always said he never knew if the man made it." Marcus sat with that for a long moment, his blind eyes fixed on nothing, his hands gripping the cane so hard his knuckles had gone pale. "He said he's been alive this whole time, and he thinks I might not have made it," Denise said quietly. "I think you two need to talk to each other." The dark part of this story had already happened years before this bench, in the space between a burning vehicle and 2 men who each carried a version of the same day that left the other one dead. Elias Cole had spent 7 years believing he had failed to save the man he'd pulled from the wreckage, that whatever he'd done in those final chaotic seconds before his own injury and the months of memory loss that followed hadn't been enough. He carried that belief the way some men carried debt, quietly, at the edges of every good moment. A private tax on his own happiness that made him hold his daughter slightly tighter than necessary and avoid, almost entirely, any conversation about his time overseas. He had never sought counseling for it, not because he didn't believe in it, but because admitting the guilt out loud felt, to him, like a second failure layered on the first, failing the man in the vehicle, then failing to carry that failure with any dignity. Marcus, for his part, had spent 6 years believing the man who saved him had died doing it, and had built an entire architecture of guilt around that belief too. The guilt of surviving because someone else hadn't. The guilt of never having found the family, never having said anything, never having done anything with the life that had been paid for at what he believed was the ultimate cost. He hadn't sought his rescuer's family because he didn't know their name beyond a nickname, and because some quieter, more honest part of him hadn't been ready, until this exact October Tuesday, to face what finding them might mean. Denise called Elias that evening and told him carefully that she'd met a blind veteran in the park whose story matched a day he'd spent 7 years. Trying not to remember in detail, Elias did not sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table after the girls were in bed, running his thumb along the ridge of his own scar, the way he sometimes did without noticing, turning over a version of the last 7 years in which the man he thought he'd failed to save had, in fact, been sitting on a park bench 11 blocks away the entire time. Listening to a city he couldn't see, they met 3 days later. Not at the park, but at Denise's suggestion. In her own living room, neutral, quiet, no children present for the first conversation. Though Ruby and Wren waited at the kitchen table with strict instructions to stay put. An instruction they followed for exactly the first 4 minutes. Marcus heard the door open. He heard a voice say, "Marcus," and something in the register of it, rough, careful, holding something back, matched a fragment of memory he hadn't fully trusted himself to keep for 7 years. A voice, close to his ear, inside a vehicle that was filling with smoke, saying, "Hold on, I've got you." "Don't you dare let go," Marcus said. Coley came out cracked. Barely a word, Elias crossed the room. "He said they told me you didn't make it. I've spent 7 years thinking I got you halfway and it wasn't enough." His voice broke on the last word. Marcus stood, reaching a hand out in the direction of the voice, and Elias closed the distance and took it. And then neither of them was entirely in control of what happened next, which was that 2 grown men who had each spent 7 years. Quietly convinced they had failed, the other stood in a stranger's living room and wept without any attempt to hide it, the way men sometimes finally can when the weight they've been carrying alone turns out to have had another set of shoulders under it the whole time. 3 states and 11 blocks away that nobody had ever told them about. Ruby and Wren appeared in the doorway at exactly this moment, their aunt's instructions forgotten entirely, and stood watching their father cry in a way they had genuinely never seen, not once in their whole lives. Ren, 7, walked over first and wrapped both arms around her father's leg. The way she did when she didn't understand something but understood it mattered. Ruby, a beat behind her, looked up at Marcus, a stranger with the same scar. And eyes that couldn't see her, but a face that had gone soft in a way strangers' faces usually didn't, and said, with the plain, unfiltered clarity children have, "Are you the man from the fire Dad talks about in his sleep?" The room went silent in a different way. Elias, still holding Marcus's hand, said quietly to his daughter, "Yeah, baby, this is him." What followed over the next months was not a miracle so much as a slow, deliberate repair. Marcus began attending the group therapy sessions at the VA that he'd avoided for 6 years. Finally willing to sit in a room and describe what had happened in the vehicle, now that he had someone across from him who remembered it too and didn't need him to perform strength he didn't have. Elias, for the first time, spoke to a counselor about the guilt he'd carried since the day of the blast. A guilt that had shaped how tightly he held his daughters and how little he let himself want for his own. Life beyond keeping them safe. The two men met most Tuesdays at the same park bench, Elias describing what Marcus couldn't see. Marcus filling in the parts of that day in the vehicle that Elias's injury had erased. Ruby and Ren, delighted by the strange, sudden appearance of what they started calling their uncle from the fire, took to walking beside Marcus, with the casual proprietary confidence of children who have decided an adult belongs to them now. Narrating the park in loud, specific detail, the color of the leaves, the dog crossing the path, the exact shape of a cloud filling in their own small, unknowing way, some of what 6 years of blindness had taken from him. On a Tuesday in December, sitting on the same bench where it had all started, Elia said, "I never got to thank you, for pulling your weight in that vehicle. You didn't just let me carry you. You kept moving even when I know it must have hurt," Marcus said. "I never got to thank you either, for not letting go." He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 6 years thinking I owed a debt I couldn't repay because the person was gone. Turns out he's just been 11 blocks away the whole time, raising 2 daughters who talk more than the both of us combined." Elias laughed, wet and real. Ruby, nearby, chasing a pigeon with Ren, called back over her shoulder without turning around, "We heard that." Marcus smiled, the scar on his face moving with it in a way he no longer flinched from concealing. He said, "Good. You should know it too. This story moved you? Please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, has a stranger's kindness or a child's honest words ever helped? You carry a weight you thought you'd have to carry alone.